Imagine a world where two superpowers glare at each other across oceans and continents, each armed with weapons powerful enough to destroy civilization. Yet instead of open war, they fight with spies, with words, with technology, and with fear. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union struggled in a conflict unlike any before it. There were no great battlefields, no declarations of victory, yet the tension defined an era. This was the Cold War, a contest, fought not with armies clashing, but with missiles built, nations divided, and dreams of spaceflight turned into weapons. Of prestige. It was a war of shadows, of rival ideologies, of nuclear dread, and of human ambition. If you enjoy calm but fascinating history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Tonight we'll drift back to the second half of the 20th century, where the world was split in two, and peace was kept not by trust, but by fear. The Cold War is often remembered as a half-century of rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, yet its roots reach back into the ashes of the Second World War. For a brief moment in the 1940s, the two superpowers were allies, united, against a common enemy. American soldiers and Soviet troops fought on opposite ends of Europe, driving back the armies of Nazi Germany until they met at the Elbe River in April 1945. Photographs from that day show smiling faces, soldiers indifferent, uniforms shaking hands, banners raised in celebration. It was a moment of unity, of shared triumph, of hope that the world might finally know peace. But beneath the surface, mistrust already ran deep. What began as an alliance of necessity soon unraveled into suspicion, and that suspicion hardened into the Cold War. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was always uneasy. Their systems were fundamentally opposed. America, a democracy built on capitalism and private enterprise. The Soviet Union, a communist state founded on central control and ideology. During the war, these differences were set aside in the urgency of survival. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Tehran and Yalta, negotiating the course of the war and imagining the shape of the peace to come. Yet each came with different goals. Roosevelt dreamed of a world governed by international cooperation through the new United Nations. Churchill sought to preserve the British Empire's strength and balance against both allies and enemies. Stalin, haunted by centuries of invasion, wanted above all to secure his borders and expand his influence into Eastern Europe. These goals overlapped just enough to defeat Hitler, but once the common enemy was gone, the cracks widened. The end of the war left the world transformed. Europe lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, millions displaced, economies shattered. Into this vacuum stepped the United States and the Soviet Union, the only two powers left standing strong. America emerged with its industries intact, its homeland untouched by bombs, its economy booming from wartime production. It possessed the world's largest navy, the world's most powerful air force, and, after August 1945, the world's only atomic bomb. The Soviet Union, though victorious, paid a staggering price. More than 20 million dead, vast tracts of land destroyed, infrastructure ruined. Yet its army was massive, battle-hardened, and occupying much of Eastern Europe. Two giants now faced each other, one wealthy and secure, The other bloodied but dominant across half a continent. At first, there were gestures of cooperation. Stalin joined Roosevelt and Churchill in founding the United Nations. Soviet representatives sat alongside Americans in San Francisco in 1945 as the charter was signed. Yet even in that hopeful moment, tensions simmered. The Soviets sought permanent control over the lands they had liberated, installing sympathetic governments in Poland, Romania, and elsewhere. The Americans insisted on free elections, pointing to the promises Stalin had made at Yalta. Both sides claimed legitimacy, but neither trusted the other's word. The death of Roosevelt in April 1945 deepened the divide. His successor, Harry Truman, was less patient with Stalin, less willing to compromise. At the Potsdam Conference in July, Truman confronted the Soviet leader, demanding adherence to agreements. Yet he also concealed a new secret: the successful test of the atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. Within weeks, that bomb would destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war in Japan and announcing to the world that America possessed a weapon of unimaginable power. To the Soviets, this was not reassurance, but threat. Stalin, already wary of Western intentions, accelerated his own atomic program, determined not to be left vulnerable. The seeds of rivalry sprouted quickly. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes tightened their grip. In Greece and Turkey, communist insurgencies clashed with Western-backed governments. In 1946, Churchill delivered his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, declaring that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, dividing East from West. The phrase captured the new reality. The wartime alliance was over, and a new struggle was beginning. Truman responded with what became known as the Truman Doctrine, a pledge to support free peoples resisting subjugation, particularly in Greece and Turkey. It was the first clear statement of America's policy of containment, the idea that communism must be stopped wherever it threatened to expand. Money and aid flowed into Europe, culminating in the Marshall Plan of 1947, which offered billions to rebuild war-torn nations. The Soviets saw this as economic imperialism, a way for the United States to bind Western Europe to its system. In turn, Stalin created the Cominform and tightened control over his sphere. The continent divided into two halves, each dominated by one superpower, each suspicious of the other's motives. The rivalry extended beyond politics and economics. In 1948, the Berlin blockade brought the first major crisis. Determined to force the West out of Berlin, Stalin cut off all land routes to the city, hoping to starve the Allied sectors into submission. The United States and its allies responded, with the Berlin airlift flying supplies into the city day and night for nearly a year. Planes landed every few minutes, delivering food, fuel, and medicine. The blockade failed, but the message was clear. Neither side would back down. Berlin became the symbol of division, a city split between East and West, freedom and communism, democracy and dictatorship. By the end of the 1940s, the Cold War was firmly in place. NATO was founded in 1949, binding Western Europe and North America into a military alliance. The same year, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. The balance of terror had begun. China fell to communism under Mao Zedong, widening the Soviet bloc. In 1950, war erupted in Korea, where American and Soviet-backed forces clashed through their proxies, drawing blood in the conflict. Neither side dared to escalate into full nuclear war. The dream of post-war peace had vanished. Allies who had toasted victory together in 1945 were now enemies locked in ideological, political, and military competition. The smiles on the Elbe had faded into suspicion. The partnership against Hitler had given way to confrontation over the future of the world. The Cold War was born not in a single event, but in the slow unraveling of trust, the steady march of fear, and the clash of visions for what humanity's future should be. Before the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had stood together as comrades in arms. After the war, they stood apart, staring across a divided Europe, each convinced that the other threatened its very survival. And so began the long struggle that would shape the 20th century, a war without open battle, but with consequences felt in every corner of the globe. When Winston Churchill stood before an audience in Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946, and declared that an iron curtain has descended across the continent, his words captured more than a metaphor. They named a reality already taking shape in post-war Europe. The wartime alliance between East and West had collapsed into suspicion, and the continent was dividing into two distinct worlds. On one side lay Western Europe, tied to the United States through aid, commerce, and democratic institutions. On the other stood Eastern Europe, bound to the Soviet Union through ideology, military presence, and authoritarian control. The curtain was not made of steel or iron, but of politics, armies, and fear. It separated neighbors, split nations, and marked the beginning of decades of tension that would define the Cold War. The roots of this division were planted even before the Second World War ended, as Soviet troops pushed westward, liberating territory from Nazi control. Stalin had no intention of relinquishing what his armies had gained. To him, Eastern Europe was a buffer zone, a shield against future invasions from the West. Russia had suffered repeated invasions over centuries. Napoleon in the 19th century, Germany in the 20th, and Stalin was determined that it would not happen again. Security for him meant control. Wherever the Red Army stood, communist regimes would soon follow. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany, the pattern repeated. Local communist parties, often small before the war, were elevated by Soviet influence. Elections were promised, but opposition candidates were harassed, silenced, or eliminated. Newspapers were censored, dissenters jailed, and soon one-party states emerged. Stalin justified this as necessary for peace, but to the West it was clear. The Soviets were building an empire in all but name. The nations of Eastern Europe became satellites, orbiting Moscow politically, economically, and militarily. Meanwhile, Western Europe faced its own struggles. War had left cities in ruins, economies shattered, and populations weary. Into this landscape came the Marshall Plan, announced by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947. It offered billions in aid to rebuild infrastructure, revive industry, and stabilize governments. Nations that accepted the plan, from France to Italy to West Germany, found themselves tied more closely to the United States. The money came with expectations. Markets would be open, democracy would be preserved and communism would be resisted. The Marshall Plan was not only an economic recovery program, it was also a political tool, drawing Western Europe firmly into the American orbit. The Soviets responded with hostility. To Stalin, the Marshall Plan was a Trojan horse, a way for the United States to dominate Europe through economics rather than armies. He forbade Eastern Bloc nations from accepting the aid, even though many desperately needed it. Instead, he created the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, to bind the economies of the Soviet sphere together. But Comecon could not match the resources of the Marshall Plan. While Western Europe slowly recovered, Eastern Europe stagnated under central planning and Soviet demands. The Iron Curtain was not only political but economic, separating prosperity. From hardship, Berlin became the most visible symbol of this division. Once the capital of Nazi Germany, the city was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Though Berlin lay deep inside the Soviet zone of East Germany, the Western Allies held their sectors. In 1948, when the Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones, the Soviets retaliated by cutting off all land and rail access to West Berlin. They hoped to starve the city into submission, forcing the Allies to abandon it. Instead, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift. For 11 months, cargo planes flew around the clock, delivering food, fuel, and supplies. At the height of the effort, a plane landed every few minutes. Children cheered as pilots dropped candy parachutes, and the city survived. By 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade, but Berlin remained divided, a microcosm of Europe itself, split between East and West. As the Iron Curtain solidified, alliances formed. In 1949, the United States and its Western allies created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, pledging mutual defense against aggression. An attack on one would be an attack on all. The Soviets saw this as encirclement, a hostile military bloc at their doorstep. They would respond in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern Europe into a military alliance under Moscow's command. The continent was now armed against itself, each half preparing for a war neither dared to fight. Propaganda deepened the divide. In the West, newspapers and radio warned of communist expansion, portraying the East as a prison of fear. In the East, state-controlled media depicted the West as decadent, corrupt, and aggressive. Children grew up learning that the other side was the enemy, that their own system was the only hope for humanity. The Iron Curtain was not just lines on a map, but ideas etched into minds, reinforced by schools, films, posters, and speeches. For ordinary Europeans, life was shaped by which side of the curtain they lived on. In the West, despite hardships, economic recovery brought new homes, jobs, and consumer goods. In the East, scarcity was common. Freedoms were curtailed, and secret police watched for dissent. Families were divided, sometimes literally. In Germany, people moved from east to west in search of opportunity, so many that in 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to stop the flow. It was concrete proof of the Iron Curtain, a barrier not of metaphor but of stone, barbed wire, and armed guards. To see it was to understand the division of the world. The Iron Curtain shaped global politics for decades. Nations aligned themselves with one side or the other, joining military blocs or economic systems. Neutral countries tried to stay outside the divide, but the pressure was immense. The Cold War was global, but its heart lay in Europe, where the line between East and West was clearest. Every crisis, every confrontation, every negotiation was framed by that division. Looking back, the Iron Curtain was not inevitable, yet once it fell, it seemed immovable. It created two worlds, each convinced of its righteousness, each suspicious of the other. It defined borders, shaped alliances, and turned Europe into the front line of a conflict that was never openly fought, but always feared. The curtain remained until the end of the century, but in its shadow, generations lived, dreamed, and endured. It was more than Churchill's metaphor. It was the defining boundary of the Cold War, the line that split not only Europe, but the very hopes of the 20th century. If the Iron Curtain divided Europe with walls, wires, and ideology, it was the nuclear arms race that cast its shadow across the entire world. From the moment the United States detonated the first atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, humanity entered a new era and age in which a single weapon could obliterate a city in seconds. What began as America's monopoly quickly became a competition of terrifying scale. The Soviet Union was determined not to remain vulnerable, and by 1949 it had tested its own atomic device. With that single blast in the Kazakh steppe, the balance of power shifted, and a race began, one measured not in miles or medals, but in megatons and missiles. It was a race that produced fear as much as strength, for every new advance brought with it the possibility of catastrophe. The earliest years of the race were marked by espionage and secrecy. The American Manhattan Project had been the most ambitious scientific undertaking of the war, bringing together thousands of scientists in hidden laboratories. Yet Soviet intelligence penetrated even this fortress, and secrets flowed to Moscow through spies like Klaus Fuchs. Stalin, already determined to match America, accelerated his program. The Soviet Union's first bomb, codenamed First Lightning, exploded in 1949, years earlier than Western experts expected. Suddenly, America no longer held the world's only atomic weapons. The monopoly was gone, and the arms race was on dot at first. Both nations possessed only a handful of bombs, delivered by heavy bombers. But soon the technology advanced. In 1952, the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb, a device hundreds of times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion vaporized an island in the Pacific, leaving a crater over a mile wide. The Soviets answered in 1953 with their own hydrogen bomb, designed by physicist Andrei Sakharov. The scale of destruction had leapt from terrifying to unthinkable. A single weapon could now erase entire metropolitan areas. With a hydrogen bomb came new strategies of deterrence. The concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, emerged. It meant that neither side could strike first without ensuring its own annihilation. If America launched its bombs, the Soviet Union would retaliate, and vice versa. The balance of terror was paradoxical. It prevented war by making war suicidal. Peace was kept not by trust or goodwill, but by the certainty that any conflict would destroy both sides. Humanity had created a world in which survival depended on the restraint of rivals. Delivery systems became the next frontier. Bombers gave way to missiles, faster and harder to stop. The Soviets shocked the world again in 1957 by launching Sputnik, the first satellite, proving that their rockets could reach beyond Earth. If a rocket could carry a satellite into orbit, it could also carry a warhead across continents. The United States responded by accelerating its own missile program, developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that could deliver nuclear destruction in minutes. Submarines joined. The race carrying missiles hidden beneath the oceans, ready to strike from anywhere. The nuclear triad bombers, land-based missiles, and submarine-launched missiles ensured that neither side could ever feel safe. The arms race was not only military, but psychological. Governments poured resources into stockpiles that grew to thousands of warheads. By the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough bombs to destroy the world many times over. Citizens lived under the shadow of mushroom clouds. In America, school children practiced duck and cover drills, crouching under desks as if a wooden tabletop could protect them from nuclear fire. Families built backyard fallout shelters, stocking them with canned food and water. In the Soviet Union, citizens were reminded of the constant threat of imperialist attack, while secret bunkers were built beneath cities. Fear seeped into daily life, a constant reminder that annihilation could come with little warning. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the fear to its peak. When American reconnaissance discovered Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. For 13 days, leaders in Washington and Moscow exchanged threats, prepared their militaries, and weighed their choices. The slightest misstep could have unleashed catastrophe. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. The Soviets agreed to withdraw. The missiles and the United States secretly pledged to remove its missiles from Turkey. The world breathed a sigh of relief, but the crisis revealed how close the arms race had brought humanity to destruction. It was a chilling lesson, one that haunted leaders for the rest of the Cold War. Yet even after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the race continued. New warheads were developed, smaller but more precise, designed for battlefields as well as cities. MIRV's multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles allowed a single missile to carry several warheads, each aimed at a different target. Anti-ballistic missile systems were tested, threatening to upset the balance of deterrence by making one side feel invulnerable. For every move, there was a counter-move, a constant cycle of escalation that seemed to have no end. That the arms race also had a profound cultural impact. Literature and film captured the anxiety of the era. Novels imagined nuclear holocausts. Films like Dr. Strangelove satirized the absurdity of deterrence, and television broadcasts carried debates about survival in a nuclear age. In both America and the Soviet Union, citizens grew accustomed to living with the possibility that tomorrow might bring destruction. It was a background hum of fear, rarely spoken, but always present. And yet, amid the terror, there was also restraint. Both sides recognized that war could not be won, only survived at unimaginable cost. Treaties began to emerge. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, and later agreements like SALT, which sought to limit stockpiles. These treaties did not end the arms race, but they placed boundaries on its most reckless extremes. Behind the rivalry, there was a shared understanding. To push too far was to invite doomdot. By the 1970s and 1980s, the stockpiles reached their zenith. Tens of thousands of warheads sat ready in silos, submarines, and air bases. The fear never vanished, but it became normalized. Children grew up with the knowledge that their world could end in fire, yet life went on. Schools opened, families shopped, governments ruled. The absurdity of it all was striking civilization balanced on a knife's edge, yet carried on as if nothing were amiss. Looking back, the nuclear arms race was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the Cold War. It shaped strategies, defined diplomacy, and haunted everyday life. It was a contest of fear disguised as power, a race in which winning meant only the ability to destroy more thoroughly. And yet, in its strange logic, it also prevented the very war it threatened. By making conflict unthinkable, it forced adversaries to find other ways to compete through espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars. The world survived, but only narrowly, and only by luck as much as by caution. The arms race was a paradox. It was both madness and stability, both terror and restraint. It revealed the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human folly. It left a legacy of stockpiles, treaties, and scars on the global imagination. Above all, it reminded humanity that the greatest power ever created could also be its undoing. The Cold War was a battle without fighting, but in the nuclear arms race, the shadow of fighting never disappeared. It lingered above every negotiation, every crisis, every night's sleep. Fear became the currency of power, and power the guarantor of peace. If nuclear weapons defined the terror of the Cold War, propaganda defined its daily rhythm. This was not merely a clash of armies or a contest of missiles. It was a battle of ideas, fought in newspapers and posters, in films and radio broadcasts, in schools, parades, and speeches. The United States and the Soviet Union were not only rival powers, they were rival visions of how humanity should live. To the Americans, capitalism, democracy, and individual freedom were the answers. To the Soviets, communism, collective strength, and central control offered the path to justice. Neither side could allow the other's vision to prevail, for to lose the war of ideas was to lose legitimacy. Thus, the propaganda war became as central to the Cold War as any missile or tank in. The United States propaganda took the form of optimism, abundance, and liberty. Posters and magazines portrayed happy families in suburban homes, stocked with modern appliances, surrounded by cars, televisions, and full supermarkets. Democracy was depicted as not only a system of governance, but a lifestyle, one filled with choices and prosperity. American leaders spoke of the free world, contrasting it with what they called the enslaved world behind the Iron Curtain. Hollywood joined the effort, producing films that celebrated freedom while subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, demonizing communism. Even cartoons joined the cause, portraying Soviet leaders as villains and American heroes as defenders of liberty. Soviet Union countered with its own vision. Soviet propaganda emphasized equality, solidarity, and strength. Posters showed workers, farmers, and soldiers standing side by side, gazing confidently toward a socialist future. Factories and collective farms were depicted as engines of progress, building a society where no one would go hungry or homeless. Soviet media depicted the United States as decadent and corrupt, a land of greed where the rich exploited the poor, where racism and inequality betrayed the very ideals it claimed to uphold. In official speeches, communism was portrayed as inevitable, the next stage in human history that would sweep aside the old order of capitalism. Both sides used propaganda not only for their own citizens, but for the wider world. Radio became a weapon of influence. The United States funded stations like Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, broadcasting messages of freedom and democracy across the Iron Curtain. These broadcasts were often jammed by Soviet authorities, but determined listeners found ways to tune in, hearing voices that contradicted the official narrative. The Soviet Union used Radio Moscow and other outlets to spread its message abroad, broadcasting in multiple languages, appealing to workers, students, and colonial nations seeking independence. Ideas crossed borders invisibly, carried by sound. Waves, fueling the silent war of persuasion. Education became another front. In American schools, children recited pledges of allegiance, studied the dangers of communism, and learned about the blessings of free enterprise. In the Soviet Union, children were taught the heroism of the October Revolution, the genius of Lenin, and the evils of capitalist exploitation. Textbooks, songs, and youth organizations shaped minds from an early age. The young pioneers in the USSR, with their red scarves and slogans of solidarity, instilled loyalty to the state. In America, Boy Scouts and civic clubs emphasized patriotism and democratic values. Each side sought not only to win battles, but to win generations. Propaganda also shaped architecture and culture. In the United States, skyscrapers, highways, and consumer products symbolized progress. World's fairs displayed televisions, computers, and futuristic kitchens, showing off the abundance of capitalist innovation. In the Soviet Union, monumental buildings, statues, and parades projected power. The May Day parade in Moscow's Red Square, with tanks rolling and missiles on display, was as much a performance as a military demonstration. It told the world and Soviet citizens that their nation was strong, unstoppable, and destined to lead. The propaganda war extended even into space. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, it was not only a technological triumph, but a propaganda victory. The beeping satellite orbiting overhead seemed to announce Soviet superiority to every corner of the globe. America responded with its own triumphs, celebrating astronauts as heroes, showing televised launches, and making space exploration a symbol of democracy's ingenuity. The space race was not just about science, it was about showing whose system could reach higher, faster, and farther. But propaganda was not only outward, it also served to maintain control at home. In the Soviet Union, strict censorship ensured that only the state's version of reality was heard. Dissident voices were silenced, foreign magazines banned, and information tightly controlled. To question the system was dangerous. In the United States, the press was freer, but fear of communism led to its own pressures. During the McCarthy era in the 1950s, accusations of communist sympathies ruined careers, silenced artists, and narrowed debate. Propaganda thrived in such climates where fear amplified messages and doubt was unwelcome. Art, music, and literature became contested. Fields, jazz, rock and roll, and later pop music were celebrated in the West as symbols of freedom, creativity, and youth. The Soviets at first condemned such music as decadent, but eventually co-opted cultural expression to promote their own ideals. Soviet writers and filmmakers were expected to follow the doctrine of socialist realism, producing works that glorified workers and the state. In the West, artists often challenged government narratives, but even their critiques could be framed as evidence of freedom itself. The very fact that dissent was possible became propaganda against the controlled culture of the East. The propaganda war reached into sports as well. Olympic Games became stages for ideological competition. Every medal was more than athletic victory. It was proof of a system's superiority. Soviet athletes, trained rigorously by the state, often dominated, while American victories were celebrated as triumphs of individual talent and free society. The cheers in stadiums echoed far beyond the tracks and fields, feeding the ongoing narrative of rivalry. Propaganda's greatest strength was its ability to shape perception. It did not always convince, but it constantly reminded people of the struggle. Citizens in both East and West were told that the other side sought their destruction, that vigilance was essential, that loyalty was patriotic. This constant drumbeat maintained the Cold War atmosphere, making peace seem temporary and fragile, making compromise seem like weakness, and yet, despite the divisions, propaganda sometimes revealed unexpected truths. When Western broadcasts described life with refrigerators, cars, and televisions, Eastern listeners dreamed of abundance. When Soviet posters celebrated equality and solidarity, Western viewers glimpsed the appeal of justice in a world of inequality. The battle of ideas was not always one-sided. It sparked curiosity, envy, and doubt. The Iron Curtain was never fully opaque to imagination. Looking back, the propaganda war was as essential to the Cold War as the arms race or the space race. It kept the conflict alive in the minds of ordinary people, reinforcing divisions while fueling determination. It turned daily life into a battlefield of symbols, where a newspaper headline or a poster on a wall carried the weight of ideology. It was a quieter war than the roar of rockets, but it was no less powerful dot in the end. Propaganda could not decide the outcome of the Cold War, but it shaped how it was experienced. It made the struggle personal, embedding the conflict into the very fabric of culture, education, and imagination. For decades, people on both sides lived not only under the shadow of nuclear weapons, but under the constant whisper of ideas wielded as weapons, ideas that defined who they were and who they believed their enemies to be. The Cold War, though often called a battle without fighting, was never free of danger. There were moments when the world seemed to stand on the very edge of catastrophe, moments when a single miscalculation could have unleashed destruction on a global scale. Among the most dangerous of these confrontations were two crises that defined the intensity of the Cold War: the struggle over Berlin and the standoff in Cuba. In these two cities, thousands of miles apart, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was laid bare. Both became symbols, both became flashpoints, and both nearly tipped the world from cold conflict into hot war. Berlin was the first and most persistent flashpoint. At the end of World War II, Germany was divided into zones of occupation, controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. For a time, this arrangement functioned, fragile though it was. But as the Cold War deepened, the city became a microcosm of the wider struggle. West Berlin stood as a tiny outpost of democracy and capitalism in the heart of communist East Germany. To the Soviets, it was an irritant, a reminder that their control was incomplete. To the West, it was a beacon, proof that freedom could survive behind the Iron Curtain. The first Berlin crisis came in 1948, when Stalin sought to push the Allies out by blockading all land and rail routes into West Berlin. The city's 2 million residents faced starvation and freezing without supplies. The United States and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, an audacious effort to supply the city entirely by air. Cargo planes landed every few minutes, carrying food, coal, and medicine. Pilots risked collisions, bad weather, and exhaustion, but the flights continued for 11 months. Children cheered as candy parachutes fell from the sky, a gesture of goodwill from American pilots. In the end, the blockade failed and Stalin lifted it, but Berlin remained divided. Its survival a symbol of Western resolve. The crisis revealed the stakes of the Cold War. Neither side was willing to yield, and both were prepared to test the other's endurance. West Berlin endured as a thorn in the side of the Soviets, and East Germans, disillusioned with life under communism, began to flee westward through the city. By the late 1950s, millions had crossed, draining the East of talent and labor. To stop the exodus, the East German government, with Soviet approval, built the Berlin Wall in 1961. Overnight, concrete barriers, barbed wire, and armed guards split the city in 2. Families were separated, friends divided, lives torn apart. For decades, the wall stood as the most visible symbol of the Cold War, an open wound across Europe's heart. To the east, it was called a protective barrier. To the west, it was proof of oppression. To the world, it was the embodiment of the Iron Curtain made stone. While Berlin embodied the division of Europe, Cuba brought the Cold War to the brink of nuclear war. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution overthrew the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Castro established a socialist government just 90 miles from Florida, shocking Washington and thrilling Moscow. The United States tried to undermine him, supporting an invasion by exiles at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The operation failed disastrously, humiliating the new Kennedy administration and pushing Castro closer to the Soviets. For Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, Cuba offered an opportunity, a chance to counter America's superiority by placing nuclear missiles within striking distance of U cities. In 1962, American reconnaissance planes discovered missile sites under construction in Cuba. Photographs showed Soviet technicians installing launchers, preparing to deploy medium-range nuclear weapons capable of reaching Washington, New York, and Chicago in minutes. The revelation stunned Kennedy and his advisors. The United States already faced Soviet missiles across the Atlantic, but Cuba was intolerable, too close, too threatening. What followed became the most dangerous 13 days in history. Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, effectively a blockade, to prevent further missiles from arriving. American warships took positions across the Caribbean, intercepting Soviet vessels. In Moscow, Khrushchev denounced the move as aggression, warning that any attack on Cuba would mean war. Around the world, people held their breath, fearful that nuclear war was only hours away. Families in America stocked shelters. Soviet citizens prepared for retaliation. The superpowers stood eye to eye, each unwilling to blink. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomacy unfolded. Letters flew between Washington and Moscow, some conciliatory, others harsh. Kennedy and his advisors debated military strikes, even invasion, but feared that such moves would trigger nuclear retaliation. Khrushchev, too, faced pressure from his generals, but sought a way to avoid catastrophe. Finally, a compromise emerged. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. Secretly, the United States also agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey, which threatened the Soviet Union's southern flank. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the missiles would be dismantled. The world exhaled. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point. It revealed the terrifying consequences of the arms race, showing how close humanity had come to destruction. Kennedy and Khrushchev both recognized the need for caution. A direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to ensure immediate communication in future crises. Treaties soon followed, such as the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere. The Cold War continued, but the memory of October 1962 haunted leaders for the rest of their lives. Berlin and Cuba together illustrated the nature of the Cold War, a conflict fought through symbols, brinkmanship, and nerves of steel. In Berlin, the struggle was for hearts and minds, for the ability to keep a city alive in the shadow of oppression. In Cuba, the struggle was for survival itself, the razor's edge of nuclear annihilation. Both crises showed the limits of power and the necessity of restraint. Neither side wanted war, yet both were willing to risk it. For ordinary people, these confrontations were lived in fear. Berliners woke to walls that split their lives in half. Cuban farmers saw foreign soldiers and missiles in their fields. American families crouched under desks during drills, wondering if it would matter. Soviet citizens listened to speeches about imperialist threats and wondered if tomorrow would bring fire. The Cold War's crises were not abstract, they were lived realities, shaping the thoughts and fears of millions. Looking back, the crises of Berlin and Cuba were reminders that the Cold War, though cold, was never safe. At any moment it could ignite, whether through miscalculation or miscommunication. That it did not was due not only to leaders' decisions, but to sheer luck. Humanity survived those years by the narrowest of margins, learning just how fragile peace could be when power was measured in nuclear fire. If the nuclear arms race filled the world with fear, the space race filled it with wonder. For the first time in history, humanity was not only looking across borders and oceans, but up beyond the atmosphere, beyond the clouds into the black silence of space. Yet even here, in the realm of dreams, the Cold War rivalry shaped every step. The Soviet Union and the United States did not compete merely to explore. They competed to prove superiority. to demonstrate that their system, communism or capitalism, collectivism or democracy, could achieve what had once seemed impossible. Space became the new frontier of prestige, a battlefield of science and imagination. The first great victory belonged to the Soviet Union. On October 4th, 1957, they launched Sputnik 1, a polished metal sphere no larger than a beach ball, but one that changed history. It circled Earth every 96 minutes, transmitting a simple beep, beep, beep that could be heard by radios around the globe. The sound was haunting and electrifying all at once. To Soviet citizens, it was a triumph of socialism, proof that their scientists and engineers had outpaced the mighty United States. To Americans, it was a shock, a reminder that the same rockets carrying satellites could also carry nuclear warheads. The space age had begun, not with peace, but with fear. The Soviets pressed their advantage. Just a month later, Sputnik 2 carried the dog Laika into orbit, the first living creature to circle the planet. Though she did not survive, the mission captured headlines worldwide. In 1959, Soviet probes reached the moon, photographing its far side for the first time. Then, in April 1961, came the greatest triumph of all, Yuri Gagarin's flight aboard Vostok 1. For 108 minutes, he orbited Earth, smiling, calm, triumphant. He became the first human in space, a hero not only to the Soviet Union, but to all who dreamed of the stars. Posters of his smiling face, his white helmet marked with spread across the globe. The Soviet Union, battered by war and hardship, stood for a moment as the leader of humanity's most daring frontier. The United States reeled from these blows. American rockets exploded on launch pads, satellites failed, and the Soviet lead seemed overwhelming. Newspapers cried out about a missile gap. Politicians warned that America's prestige was collapsing. President Dwight Eisenhower tried to calm fears, but when John F. Kennedy entered the White House, he recognized the need for a bold response. In May 1961, just weeks after Gagarin's flight, Kennedy stood before Congress and declared, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth." The words electrified America. The moon became the new target, and Apollo became the program that would carry the dream. The path to the moon was not quick nor easy. America's Project Mercury put its first astronauts into space. Alan Shepard's suborbital hop in May 1961, John Glenn's orbital flight in 1962. These were small steps compared to Gagarin, but they restored pride. Next came Project Gemini, which tested longer missions, spacewalks, and orbital maneuvers. Astronauts learned to rendezvous and dock spacecraft in orbit, skills essential for lunar missions. With every launch, every photograph, every splashdown, America drew closer to its goal. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued to push forward. German Titov spent a full day in orbit. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space in 1963. Alexei Leonov stepped outside his capsule in 1965, becoming the first human to walk in space, though nearly suffocating when his suit ballooned in the vacuum. Each milestone added to Soviet prestige, but behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Their N-1 rocket, designed to rival America's Saturn V, suffered catastrophic failures. Their lunar program faltered, resources stretched, secrecy stifled innovation. The Soviet Union remained ahead in firsts, but the United States was closing in on the ultimate prize. The Apollo program became the largest technological effort in American history. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, and workers built rockets, spacecraft, computers, and launch facilities. The Saturn V, a towering giant, became the most powerful machine ever created, capable of sending men beyond Earth's orbit. Yet Apollo was also scarred by tragedy. In 1967, Apollo 1 ended in fire, killing Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a ground test. The nation mourned, investigations followed, and NASA redesigned its systems to make them safer. Out of ashes came determination. The mission would go on dot by 1968. Apollo regained momentum. Apollo 7 tested the redesigned spacecraft in orbit. Apollo 8 became the first mission to circle the moon, broadcasting images of Earth rising over its barren horizon, a sight that moved millions, reminding humanity of its fragile unity. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10 rehearsed the landing, descending within miles of the surface. Each step built toward the goal Kennedy had set. And then came Apollo 11. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins climbed aboard the Saturn V at Cape Kennedy. Millions watched as the rocket lifted into the sky, carrying with it not only 3 men, but the hopes of a nation and the weight of a decade. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin descended in the lunar module Eagle, guiding it past craters, boulders, until at last it settled on the surface. Armstrong's words as he stepped down: "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed through history. For the first time, human footprints marked the moon. The world watched in awe. Even in the Soviet Union, where official media muted the achievement, ordinary citizens marveled. For one brief moment, humanity seemed united, not divided. Yet in the Cold War context, Apollo 11 was also victory, a demonstration that America had not only caught up, but surpassed its rival. The United States had claimed the moon, and with it, the prestige of leadership in the space age. The space race did not end in 1969, but it had reached its climax. The Soviets continued with Soyuz missions and focused on space stations, while America sent more Apollo crews to the moon. Yet the sense of urgency faded. The great contest had been decided, not by missiles or armies, but by a footprint in lunar dust. Looking back, the space race was both rivalry and inspiration. It was born from fear, fueled by competition, and paid for with immense resources. But it also expanded human imagination. Satellites transformed communication. Probes explored planets. Astronauts showed that humanity could survive beyond Earth. The Cold War turned space into a battlefield of prestige, but in doing so it pushed humanity farther than it might otherwise have gone. The beeping of Sputnik, the smile of Gagarin, the step of Armstrong all remain as milestones, not only of competition, but of humanity's first reach for the stars. When historians tell the story of the Cold War, they often focus on leaders, crises, weapons, and treaties. But for most people alive between 1945 and 1991, the Cold War was not experienced in diplomatic cables or missile tests. It was lived in the small routines of daily life. In the schools children attended, in the groceries families bought, in the television shows people watched, in the whispered fears before bed. The world was divided, but people still lived, worked, laughed, and dreamed. Yet in both East and West, their lives were shaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes starkly, by the shadow of the Cold War. In the United States, the Cold War era produced a peculiar mixture of optimism and fear. On one hand, the economy boomed. After the Second World War, soldiers returned home. Suburbs expanded, cars filled highways, and televisions became fixtures in living rooms. Families moved into neat houses with manicured lawns. Children played in tree-lined neighborhoods, and supermarkets overflowed with goods. For many Americans, this was the American dream realized, and it stood as a living advertisement against communism. Every refrigerator, every washing machine, every shiny new automobile was presented not only as comfort, but as proof that capitalism worked. Yet beneath the prosperity lay anxiety. The same government that celebrated abundance also prepared its citizens for nuclear catastrophe. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks in case of atomic attack. Public service films showed mushroom clouds, followed by calm voices explaining survival tactics. Civil defense pamphlets taught families how to build backyard fallout shelters, stocked with canned food and water. Magazines carried advertisements for shelter kits, as though nuclear war could be endured with the right equipment. For children, the Cold War was both comic books about superheroes and lessons about annihilation. For parents, it was both the pride of prosperity and the unease of knowing it could all vanish in an instant. Across the ocean, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, life carried a different rhythm. For many citizens, daily existence was marked by shortages, queues, and state control. Shops often lacked variety, with people waiting in long lines for bread, meat, or basic goods. Apartments in gray concrete blocks, known as Khrushchevkas, became homes for millions. They were functional but plain, built quickly to house growing urban populations. The state provided work, education, and health care, but freedom of choice was limited. Families lived modestly, but they also lived with stability. Jobs were guaranteed. Rents were low, and children were enrolled in schools without fees. Propaganda. Posters proclaimed equality and progress, though reality often fell short. In schools, Soviet children wore red scarves as members of the Young Pioneers, learning songs of solidarity and reading about Lenin's vision. They marched in parades on May Day, carrying banners and balloons, while military hardware rolled past Red Square. Television and radio extolled the achievements of the state, from space triumphs to agricultural successes, even when those successes were exaggerated or false. Dissent was dangerous. Conversations at kitchen tables were cautious, words chosen carefully, for the wrong comment could invite suspicion. The KGB listened, and neighbors were sometimes informants. Yet life was not only fear. It was also community, friendship, literature, music, and laughter lived within the boundaries of the system. The contrast between East and West was not only material, but cultural. In the United States, pop culture exploded with rock and roll, Hollywood films, and consumer advertising. Elvis Presley sang on radios. Marilyn Monroe smiled from movie screens, and Coca-Cola became a global icon. These cultural exports themselves became weapons in the Cold War, symbols of freedom and abundance. In the Soviet bloc, Western music and films were often banned or heavily restricted, but they still seeped through smuggled records, foreign broadcasts, whispered stories of life beyond the Iron Curtain. To young people in Prague, Budapest, or Moscow, the sound of jazz or the sight of Liva's jeans represented not only style, but the possibility of another world. At the same time, the Soviet Union cultivated its own cultural identity. Ballet companies, classical music, and literature flourished, upheld as symbols of refinement and depth. Sports became arenas of competition, with Olympic athletes trained rigorously to demonstrate socialist superiority. Victories on the field or in the pool were celebrated as national achievements, proof that communism could produce excellence. Citizens cheered athletes not only as champions, but as symbols of ideology. In the West, Olympic victories were equally politicized, every medal a triumph of freedom over tyranny. Even play became propaganda. Everyday life was shaped not only by governments, but by the constant awareness of division. In Germany, families were literally separated by the Berlin Wall. Brothers and sisters, parents and children found themselves cut off by barbed wire and concrete. For years, West Berliners lived with the knowledge that just across the wall lay neighbors trapped in a different system. East Berliners, meanwhile, lived with guards, watchtowers, and the knowledge that escape could mean death. Yet despite the barrier, people continued to write letters, send packages, and hope for reunion. In both East and West, science and technology permeated daily life. Space launches were broadcast as national triumphs. New consumer goods radios, televisions, later computers, were celebrated as proof of progress. The rivalry pushed innovation, and ordinary families reaped some benefits. Yet technology also carried fear. Sirens wailed during drills. Posters showed maps of fallout zones. Even toys and games reflected the conflict children played with. Plastic soldiers, model rockets, and board games about spies. The Cold War was not confined to newspapers. It was woven into childhood itself. Religion, too, became part of everyday Cold War identity. In the United States, politicians spoke of faith as a foundation of freedom, contrasting it with what they portrayed as the atheism of communism. Church attendance boomed in the 1950s, and phrases like, "In God we trust," were added to currency. Under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. In the Soviet Union, religion was officially discouraged, churches monitored or closed, priests harassed. Yet faith survived quietly in homes and communities, sometimes hidden, sometimes resisted. Belief itself became a quiet act of defiance. For some, while in America it was framed as patriotic. Despite the divisions, there were surprising similarities. In both East and West, families gathered for meals, children went to school, workers commuted to jobs, young people dreamed of futures. Weddings were celebrated, holidays observed, music played, and books read. In both worlds, parents hoped for better lives for their children. The Cold War shaped the structures around them, but human life persisted within those structures. Love, joy, and sorrow did not vanish, even when shadowed by ideology. Everyday life in a divided world was marked by paradox. In the West, abundance created confidence, but also consumerism. In the East, shortages bred frustration, but also resilience and community. Both sides lived with fear, but also with hope. Both believed that their way of life was superior, and both saw the other as misguided. Yet beneath the layers of propaganda and politics, people lived much the same as they always had, working, learning, raising families, dreaming of tomorrow, looking back. It is easy to see the Cold War only as missiles, speeches, and treaties. But its true legacy lies in how it shaped daily existence. It taught children to crouch under desks. It placed walls between families. It filled supermarkets or emptied them. It colored the songs people sang and the stories they told. It was lived not only in the halls of power, but in kitchens, classrooms, and city streets. The Cold War was global, but for most, it was personal. It was the neighbor who disappeared after speaking too freely. It was the father who built a shelter in the backyard. It was the teenager secretly listening to Western rock on a smuggled radio. It was the child gazing at the moon, knowing men had walked there, and wondering what future awaited. Everyday life carried the weight of rivalry, but it also carried the persistence of humanity. And in that persistence, in the ordinary rhythms of divided worlds, the Cold War truly lived. The Cold War is often called a conflict without direct fighting between the superpowers. Yet this is only partly true. The United States and the Soviet Union never exchanged nuclear fire, never launched armies directly against one another, but their rivalry spilled across the globe in other ways. In Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, wars were fought not by Washington and Moscow themselves, but by allies, clients, and movements each side supported. These were the proxy wars of the Cold War conflicts, in which local struggles for independence, power, or ideology became entangled in the wider contest between communism and capitalism. For the people who lived through them, the Cold War was anything but cold. The Korean War was the first and perhaps most striking example. In 1950, Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, invaded South Korea, supported by the United States and the United Nations. The war quickly escalated from a local conflict into a global one. American troops fought alongside South Koreans, while Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River to aid the North. For 3 years, brutal battles raged. Cities were destroyed. Millions of civilians displaced. In the end, the war settled into stalemate, with the border near its original line. Korea remained divided, North and South glaring at each other across a heavily armed, demilitarized zone. The war demonstrated that while the superpowers would not fight each other directly, they were willing to fight through others, turning local. Disputes into Cold War flashpoints. Vietnam became the most infamous of these proxy wars. What began as a struggle for independence from colonial rule became a battlefield of ideology. North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, sought to unify the country under communism. The United States, fearing the domino theory that one nation falling to communism would lead others to follow, poured in troops, money, and weapons to support South Vietnam. The war stretched for years, draining American resources, dividing its society, and costing millions of lives across the region. For the Vietnamese, it was not simply a Cold War struggle, but a fight for their homeland. Yet for Washington and Moscow, it was another front in their global rivalry. When the United States withdrew in 1973 and Saigon fell in 1975, The outcome was seen not only as a victory for Vietnam, but as a blow to American prestige in the Cold War. Proxy wars were not confined to Asia. In Latin America, the Cold War played out in revolutions and counter-revolutions. Cuba became the most prominent case. After Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union, providing Moscow with a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The United States responded with embargoes, assassination attempts, and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Beyond Cuba, U.S. intelligence agencies supported anti-communist movements and governments across the region, while the Soviets aided leftist guerrillas. In countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Chile, political struggles became stages for superpower interference, leaving scars that lasted long after the Cold War ended. In Africa, decolonization provided fertile ground for proxy battles. As European empires withdrew, new nations emerged, often fragile and contested. The United States and Soviet Union sought influence, offering aid, weapons, and advisors. In Angola, rival factions received support from Moscow and Washington. There, conflict dragging on for decades. In Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Congo, shifting alliances and superpower backing turned local disputes into prolonged wars. For many Africans, independence was quickly overshadowed by the intrusion of distant powers pursuing their rivalry through local conflicts. The Middle East, too, became a theater of proxy competition. The Arab-Israeli conflicts of 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973 drew in Cold War tensions, with the United States backing Israel and the Soviets supporting various Arab states. Beyond the battlefield, oil and geography made the region strategically vital, and both superpowers sought allies. Coups, revolutions, and wars were fueled by external support, each side wary of losing influence in such a critical part of the world. Even in places where open war did not erupt, the Cold War played out through coups, insurgencies, and covert operations. Intelligence agencies, the CIA in America, the KGB in the Soviet Union, worked behind the scenes, funding parties, influencing elections, arming rebels, or toppling governments. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973. Each was a stage where superpowers pulled strings, sometimes invisibly, but with consequences that reshaped nations. For the people caught in these proxy wars, the Cold War was not abstract. It was hunger, displacement, bombs falling, soldiers marching. It was the arrival of weapons stamped with foreign markings, the appearance of advisors speaking unfamiliar languages, the intrusion of distant ideologies into local struggles. For the United States and Soviet Union, these wars were about influence and ideology. For the people on the ground, they were about survival. The irony of proxy wars is that neither superpower ever achieved total victory through them. Korea remained divided. Vietnam became communist, but did not trigger the domino effect. Latin America resisted complete alignment, Africa remained fractured, and the Middle East stayed unstable. Each intervention brought short-term gains, but long-term costs, sowing distrust, resentment, and instability. The superpowers battled without battlegrounds of their own, but the battlegrounds they chose left deep scars on others. Proxy wars also revealed the limitations of power. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could impose its will everywhere. Local actors had their own agendas and often used superpower support for their own ends. Leaders in small countries learned to play Washington and Moscow against each other, extracting aid, weapons, or legitimacy. The Cold War's global reach was real, but its control was never absolute. Looking back, the proxy wars remind us that the Cold War was not bloodless. While Europe remained divided but stable, millions elsewhere paid the price of rivalry. Entire generations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America grew up amid conflicts shaped by superpower competition. For them, the Cold War was not a chess match of ideology, but a struggle of flesh and blood. And yet, in a strange way, proxy wars also preserved the peace between the superpowers. By fighting indirectly, by channeling their rivalry into distant conflicts, Washington and Moscow avoided direct confrontation. The wars were devastating, but they kept the nuclear weapons silent. Proxy wars were the Cold War's terrible compromise. Devastation in the periphery to avoid apocalypse at the center. The Cold War is often remembered for its crises and confrontations: the Berlin blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, but much of the struggle was waged in quieter ways, through diplomacy, cautious agreements, subtle gestures, and the secret world of espionage. The decades from the late 1960s into the 1970s were marked by an uneasy thaw, a period historians call détente, when the superpowers sought to reduce tensions even while mistrust remained. And behind the conference tables and press statements, spies crept through shadows. Satellites photographed secrets, and intelligence agencies played their own dangerous games. It was a war of whispers as much as of weapons. By the mid-1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that the arms race and constant brinkmanship were unsustainable. The Cuban Missile Crisis had shown just how close the world could come to annihilation. Stockpiles of nuclear weapons were growing into the tens of thousands, but each new warhead added less to security and more to fear. Economically, both sides faced strains. The United States burdened by the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union weighed down by inefficiencies in its command economy. Leaders began to see value in easing tensions, not in friendship, but in survival. The concept of détente, French for relaxation, captured this mood. It did not mean the end of rivalry, but a slowing of its most dangerous aspects. Diplomacy became a tool to manage the conflict. Treaties sought to limit nuclear testing, restrict stockpiles, and create channels of communication. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, though underground tests continued. More significant were the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, which began in 1969. By 1972, SALT produced agreements limiting the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and creating the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which restricted defensive systems to preserve the logic of deterrence. These treaties did not eliminate weapons, but they acknowledged the shared danger of unchecked competition. Diplomacy also extended beyond weapons. In 1975, 35 nations signed the Helsinki Accords, recognizing borders in Europe while also affirming commitments to human rights and cooperation. For the Soviet Union, the Accords legitimized its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. For the West, the human rights provisions provided a platform to pressure the Soviets on issues of freedom and dissent. It was a compromise, a balancing act, emblematic of détente itself. Neither side achieved total victory, but both secured gains. The personalities of leaders shaped détente. In the United States, President Richard Nixon and his advisor Henry Kissinger pursued a strategy of realism, focusing on balancing power rather than ideology. Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972 marked a dramatic moment, an American president shaking hands with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, smiling for cameras, signing agreements. Just as significant was Nixon's opening to China, exploiting the Sino-Soviet split to shift the balance of power. The Soviet Union, wary of isolation, found reason to cooperate with Washington. For Brezhnev, détente offered economic benefits. The Soviet Union sought Western technology and trade, hoping to modernize its industries. Grain deals, pipeline agreements, and cultural exchanges followed. For ordinary citizens, détente meant glimpses of the other side, exhibitions of art, tours by orchestras, and limited exchanges of students and athletes. Propaganda still painted the rival as dangerous, but for the first time in decades, some doors cracked open. Yet détente was never free of suspicion. Each handshake was shadowed by mistrust, each treaty hedged with loopholes. While leaders smiled in public, their intelligence agencies prowled in secret. Espionage was the Cold War's constant companion. Its hidden battlefield, the CIA and the KGB, became symbols of this clandestine war. In embassies, safe houses, and back alleys, spies traded secrets, recruited agents, and passed microfilms. Diplomats doubled as informants. Scientists were courted with offers of money or ideology. Double agents played dangerous games, betraying one side while pretending loyalty. The names of spies Oleg Penkovsky, Alder James, Kim Philby became legendary, their actions shaping the course of policy. A single briefcase of documents could alter strategy. A single defection could expose networks. Technology transformed. Espionage. Satellites peered down from orbit, photographing missile silos, air bases, and troop movements. Listening posts intercepted radio signals, deciphering codes. Tiny microphones were hidden in offices and hotel rooms. The Soviets famously bugged the Great Seal of the United States, presented as a gift to the American Embassy in Moscow, a device that operated for years before discovery. In turn, American intelligence planted its own devices, conducted aerial reconnaissance, and sent submarines to tap undersea cables. Espionage was not only about secrets, it was also about perception. Each side wanted to know the other's intentions, to gauge whether a treaty was sincere or a deception, whether a build-up signaled preparation for war or bluff. Intelligence failures could be disastrous, but so could overestimations. The paranoia of the Cold War fed the appetite for information, and spies became the nervous system of strategy. Détente eased the temperature of the Cold War, but it did not extinguish it. Conflicts still flared in the Third World, from Angola to Afghanistan, where proxy wars raged. In the late 1970s, détente began to unravel. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 shattered hopes of cooperation. And the United States, under President Jimmy Carter and later Ronald Reagan, shifted back toward confrontation. Yet even in those darker years, the legacy of détente remained. Channels of communication, recognition of limits, and an awareness that diplomacy could prevent disaster. Espionage, meanwhile, never ceased. In fact, it flourished. Even as leaders spoke of peace, spies continued their work, feeding mistrust but also preventing surprises. Intelligence sometimes revealed threats that diplomacy could then diffuse. The secret world both fueled paranoia and provided stability, a paradox at the heart of the Cold War. Looking back, diplomacy, détente, and espionage revealed the complexity of the Cold War. It was not only a contest of weapons and wars, but also of words, treaties, and secrets. Leaders shook hands while spies eavesdropped. Treaties limited weapons even as stockpiles grew. Cooperation and rivalry coexisted in fragile balance. The Cold War was never simply hot or cold, open or hidden. It was all of these at once. Ordinary people, détente meant moments of hope, glimpses of peace, a sense that the world might step back from the brink. For those in the shadows, espionage meant constant vigilance, double lives, and risks measured in whispers. Together, these elements remind us that the Cold War was fought not only on battlefields or in speeches, but also in the quiet rooms of negotiation and the unseen alleys of espionage. It was a war of patience, deception, and fragile trust, a war that endured because neither side could fully win, but neither dared to lose. For more than 4 decades, the Cold War seemed permanent. Children were born, grew up, and started their own families under its shadow. Politicians came and went, treaties were signed and broken, crises flared and faded, but the rivalry endured. By the 1980s, the Cold War had become a fixture of life, something unshakable, as natural as sunrise. Few could imagine a world without the Iron Curtain, without the Soviet Union and the United States glaring at one another across divided continents. And yet, in less than a decade, the seemingly unmovable structure of the Cold War collapsed. It did not end in mushroom clouds or great battles, but in protests, reforms, and a quiet unraveling that stunned the world. The Soviet Union entered the 1980s, already burdened by deep problems. Its economy, once hailed as a miracle of industrial growth, had slowed to stagnation. Central planning struggled to keep up with modern technology. Factories produced vast quantities of goods, but often of poor quality. Shortages were common: empty shelves, long queues, rationing of meat or sugar. Citizens joked grimly that the Soviet system was strong enough to launch rockets into space, but not efficient enough to stock grocery stores. Meanwhile, military spending consumed enormous resources, as the USSR sought to match the United States weapon for weapon. The burden of sustaining an empire across Eastern Europe, of subsidizing allies from Cuba to Afghanistan, strained the system further. Afghanistan proved particularly costly. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded to support a faltering communist government, expecting a quick victory. Instead, it became their version of Vietnam, a grinding, demoralizing war against guerrilla fighters supplied by the West. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died, tens of thousands were wounded, and the war drained morale and treasure. At home, mothers wept for sons sent back in zinc coffins, while the official press insisted on victory. The gap between propaganda and reality widened. and faith in the system weakened. Meanwhile, in the West, the United States under President Ronald Reagan pursued a strategy of renewed confrontation. Reagan denounced the Soviet Union as an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup. His Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars, proposed futuristic missile defense systems that the Soviets feared they could never match. At the same time, the American economy surged ahead, fueled by technology and consumer growth. The contrast was stark: a vibrant, dynamic West versus a weary, stagnant East. Inside the Soviet Union, the need for change became undeniable. In 1985, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, rose to power. Younger and more open than his predecessors, he recognized that the system was failing. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring aimed to revive the Soviet Union by loosening censorship, encouraging limited reforms, and introducing elements of a market economy. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could criticize the government openly, read previously banned books, and discuss problems without fear of immediate repression. But with openness came discontent. People who had endured shortages and restrictions began to demand more, faster, deeper reforms. What Gorbachev hoped would save the system began to undermine it. The ripple effects spread quickly through Eastern Europe. For years, communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond had survived through Soviet backing. With Gorbachev signaling that the USSR would no longer use force to keep them in power, the floodgates opened. In 1989, Poland's Solidarity movement won elections, toppling the communist government. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee westward. Protests swelled across East Germany, and in November 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell. Crowds of East and West Berliners climbed the wall, chipped at it with hammers, and embraced atop its ruins. The symbol of division, the very heart of the Cold War, crumbled before the world's eyes. The dominoes fell quickly. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution swept away its regime without violence. Romania's dictatorship collapsed in blood, its leader executed by his own people. One by one, Eastern European nations freed themselves, choosing democracy, capitalism, and independence. The Warsaw Pact, once the Soviet counterweight to NATO, dissolved. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for nearly half a century vanished in a matter of months. Within the Soviet Union itself, pressures mounted. Nationalist movements surged in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, demanding independence. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, ethnic tensions flared. Russians themselves grew. Restless, frustrated with shortages, and inspired by the revolutions abroad. Gorbachev tried to hold the Union together, balancing reform and control, but the tide was against him. In August 1991, hardline communists staged a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest. But the people, led by Boris Yeltsin in Moscow, resisted. Crowds filled the streets, defying tanks, defending democracy. The coup collapsed in days, but the Soviet Union was fatally weakened. By December 1991, the end was official. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the tricolor of Russia. 15 independent republics emerged from the ruins of the Union. The Cold War was over, not with a bang, but with dissolution. America stood as the sole superpower, its rival gone, its victory complete. Yet even in victory there was unease. What would come next? What did it mean to live in a world no longer defined by the Cold War? For those who had lived under the Cold War, its end brought mixed emotions. In Eastern Europe, joy and relief surged as people tore down statues, opened borders, and embraced new freedoms. In Russia, chaos and hardship followed as the sudden transition to capitalism brought inflation, unemployment, and uncertainty. In the West, celebration was tempered by new questions. With the enemy gone, what purpose would alliances like NATO serve? Could peace last, or would new rivalries emerge? Looking back, the end of the Cold War feels both inevitable and astonishing. Inevitable, because the Soviet system was straining under contradictions it could no longer sustain. Astonishing, because so many had assumed the conflict would last forever, perhaps ending only in war. Instead, it ended peacefully, through reforms, protests, and collapses. The wall that divided Europe fell not with bombs, but with hammers in the hands of ordinary citizens. The Cold War began with allies turned rivals, hardened into decades of division, and ended in dissolution. It reshaped the 20th century, touching every corner of the globe, shaping lives, ideas, and nations. Its end marked not just the fall of the Soviet Union, but the close of an era in which fear and rivalry defined the world. The Cold War's story is one of danger, ideology, competition, and survival, and its end remains one of the most remarkable moments in modern history. A war that never turned hot, finally extinguished, not by force, but by change from within.